Inflation. They win, you lose. Politicos, cronies, fleece Canadians with monetary expansion. One of the most widespread economic myths is that inflation, the reduced purchasing power of a currency, is a win for a nation, a sign of a booming economy. For the privileged classes in government and with initial access to monetary expansion, it is a win. For everyone else, it is a stealth confiscation, a loss of wealth and power. As my macroeconomics instructor used to say, by devaluing the currency, you are fleecing the workers, especially those on fixed compensation. Inflation has averaged 5.9% over the past year through November 2023, well above the central bank's inflation rate target of 2%. That 5.9% inflation rate is triple what it was in 2021, and it attests to negative real interest rates, nominal-less inflation. What makes Canada's predictable bout of inflation particularly worrisome is that we are forgetting the lessons of recent history. The New Zealand way worked. In the late 1980s, the New Zealand Parliament mandated that the central bank focus exclusively on price stability, 0 to 2% inflation. The rationale was simple. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand should not be subject to political cycles, nor engage in Keynesian trickery. Although tempting in the short run, attempts to game the economy and incentivize higher employment are deleterious in the long run. Further, placing responsibility on a central bank to fix an economy distracts from the market reforms necessary for productivity growth, which does not derive from the printing press. As economist Lawrence White has explained throughout his academic career, free banking would be superior to central banking. However, so long as there is a central bank, its mandate is best limited. Such was New Zealand's success. Many nations swiftly followed her lead and adopted inflation targeting, including Canada in 1991. No inflation at all is necessary, and limiting it to 2% in Canada was superior to the double-digit inflation of the 1970s and 1980s. The Fed led others astray. The US Federal Reserve oversees the world's reserve currency and has immense influence beyond the United States. As I write this in January 2024, for example, the recent news is that the Fed has peaked with raising interest rates. With cuts ahead, portfolio manager Adrian Day writes, quote, other central banks indicated they will follow the Fed, unquote. The Bank of Canada, BOC, is one of the followers and likely to cut rates this coming year. During the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis, the US central bank took a variety of unprecedented measures to expand the money supply and facilitate bailouts for major players on Wall Street. In many ways, this was the straw that broke the camel's back and signaled a mission creep, albeit not explicit, of central bank meddling in economic affairs beyond what had ever occurred before. The BOC, under David Dodge and Mark Carney, was not as reckless as the Fed at that time. However, the Fed normalized departures from a clear mandate of price stability. Henceforth, there were elevated expectations that central banks would lend a hand during difficult times and offer so-called economic stimulus. Even erudite organizations such as the C.D. Howe Institute's Monetary Policy Council, centered in Toronto, have succumbed to the pressure to support monetary expansion in the face of glaring inflation. Since COVID-19's arrival in North America, both the Fed and the BOC have steered the two economies further into uncharted waters. The two institutions have facilitated astronomical fiscal deficits and monetary expansion. Out-of-control inflation, particularly ballooning house prices, is a symptom of the helicopter money. Inflation also stems from a suffocated economy on the supply side, which means more loonies chasing fewer items. As C.D. Howe Institute CEO William Robson told the Financial Post in December 2023, quote, the fact that the Canadian economy's productive capacity isn't growing very quickly means that for a given amount of demand, you've just got a bit more inflationary pressure than you would have otherwise, unquote. Cui bono? The problem with assessing inflation's impacts is that they are asymmetric. Akin to trade protectionism, such as Canada's notorious supply management, inflation, on net, harms the economy. However, some sectors of the economy benefit profusely. The narrow set of beneficiaries will do all they can to muddy the water and persuade everyone else that the policy is in their best interests too. We have seen this tale told to Canadians, especially from political incumbents and their patrons such as public sector unions, with their inflation-indexed compensation. They form a partnership as chief beneficiaries of deficits and easy credit. Inflation be damned. The current Prime Minister of Canada famously said, quote, "I don't think about monetary policy," unquote, as though inflation is not a problem. In September 2022, the BOC justified its 3.25% target overnight interest rate by saying the economy requires a tighter monetary policy. The inference after earlier central bank activism was that money supply tinkering is the medicine Canada needs, as opposed to a swiftly opened economy. The BOC has also pretended it has everything under control, describing elevated inflation as transitory. It is not. Consider how different the COVID-19 response would have been had the federal government been limited to private credit only. In other words, without the BOC buying up the bonds. Not only would many companies have had to live without bailouts, such as the $5.9 billion that went to Air Canada in 2020, but the federal government would also have had to tighten its belt and open the economy sooner. Rarely do I quote the Socialist Equality Party of Canada, but even they see the problem. The working class is paying, quote, for the more than $650 billion the current Liberal Party government and Bank of Canada funneled into the financial markets and coffers of corporate Canada at the beginning of the pandemic, unquote. This is inflation's untold story beyond what one reads in textbooks about menu and shoe leather costs, economic uncertainty, and the hit to workers on fixed incomes. Such costs are serious, and we ought to be aware of them as a silent tax. However, there is also the problem of a privileged, cocooned elite. They defend inflation as part and parcel of central banking, which favors them within a bloated state. Only with a central bank partnership can governments expand their powers and spending in such a brazen manner, all the while throwing a few scraps to the peasants for votes.